Good evening, and welcome to Mid-Valley Bible Church's virtual prayer meeting for Wednesday, October 6th. My name is Doug Hornock, and I'm the pastor here at Mid-Valley Bible Church. There are dozens of verses in the Bible that call us, as Christians, to strive and work towards Christ likeness. Four of the most succinct verses are what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11:1, where we're told to be imitators of me, that is Paul, as I am of Christ. John in 1 John 2:6 says, whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way in which he walked, speaking of Jesus. Peter in 1 Peter 2:21 says, for to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. And finally, Paul in Ephesians 5:1 and 2 says, therefore be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love, as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. Now, those are just four of many verses that call us to live like Jesus. And what I want to do tonight is share with you what I shared with the men that I meet with each Tuesday morning for breakfast and Bible study. Each Tuesday there are about a dozen men that come, not always at the same time, and every week, but they come and we have a wonderful time of fellowship. And the passage of scripture that we looked at this morning was found in Mark 3, where Jesus heals a man who had a withered hand. We're told that Jesus entered a synagogue again, and a man was there whose hand was withered. And they, that is, the religious leaders, were watching Jesus closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. Jesus said to the man with the withered hand, get up and come forward. And then Jesus said to the religious leaders, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do harm, to save a life or to kill? But they kept silent. After looking around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately began conspiring with the Herodians against him as to how they might put him to death. Now, I love that story. I love it because in that very brief encounter, there is a wealth of truth and insights revealed about Jesus. And I want to just highlight 7 of them. First of all, Jesus loved to worship and go to church. Jesus was always happy to meet with those who came to the synagogue, and he never missed the opportunity to be with them. Now, I realize there's a world of difference between Old Testament worship and New Testament worship, between the church and the synagogue. But as you look at the life of Jesus, you discover that worshiping was a huge part of his life. He didn't blow it off. He went to church with God's people. On the Sabbath, he observed the feast days. Worship was an integral part of his life. Second, Jesus could be counted on to react toward the needy with compassion. This incident, as you look at it carefully, was a setup by the religious leaders to see how Jesus would respond. And even the enemies knew that Jesus could never pass up a needy individual. When Jesus came upon a blind man, he healed him. If he crossed a diseased woman in his path, he made her whole. When he happened upon a funeral procession, he raised the dead. So the Pharisees are setting a trap for Jesus by putting this man with a deformity in the midst of that Sabbath day celebration at the synagogue. They knew that Jesus was walking right into their trap, but he did so with his eyes wide open. And that is the third observation. Jesus made himself vulnerable in order to bless people. He knew full well what was going on. And yet, in order to help this man and rebuke the self-righteous and declare his own identity, he played their game. He had work to do, and he did it. Fourth, Jesus loved to challenge people's shallow thinking. Because before healing this man, Jesus asked the Pharisees to apply reason to their opposition. So he asked them a penetrating and probing question. Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath or to do harm, to save a life or to kill? And at this point of the story, you've got to give them credit. They knew that if they answered, he had them either way. Jesus had them between a rock and a hard place. And so they kept silent. They said nothing. Fifth, Jesus' anger was sharp as towards religious people with hard hearts. As I said, they kept silent. They said nothing. And the text tells us that Jesus looked at them with anger and was grieved over the hardness of their hearts. These religious hypocrites were caught in the crosshairs of his righteous indignation. They had forgotten their original purpose and forsook the very people God wanted them to help. They had become bigots, self-righteous, and tyrannical leaders. Sixth, Jesus did not mind asking people to do what they could not do in order to grow them. That's why he asked this man with a withered hand, a shriveled up hand, a paralyzed hand, to stretch it out. And Jesus is always asking us to stretch out that part of our life, our faith, our hope, our love, our vision that needs to grow most. And the final lesson is this. If the best measure of a man is the behavior of his enemies towards him, then Jesus was incredibly righteous and a threat to the hypocritical religious leaders of his day. I think one of the best ways to size up a candidate for a position is to find out what his enemies and detractors say about him. We've been called to be followers of Jesus, to be his disciples, and it's a privilege and blessing. And so we ought not be surprised when we experience opposition as Jesus experienced opposition. And one of the ways for dealing with that opposition is by praying. And so with that before us, let's now go to the Lord in prayer and pray for the needs that are before us as a church.